The paper trembled slightly beneath his hand, though not from fear. The war was over. The cells around him echoed with silence, broken only by the distant hum of occupation trucks outside. A former admiral, once entrusted with fleets, now sat on a wooden bench in a cold prison. His pen traced out the words that none of his comrades had dared to admit aloud during the war. We were never equals. We set ourselves against an ocean of steel and fire that no strategy could contain. He paused, staring through the barred window at the broken skyline. Only months earlier, Tokyo had burned for nights on end, entire districts erased in storms of flame. Yet what haunted him more than the ruins was the memory of the numbers, production schedules, shipyard reports, and fuel tallies that he had ignored or dismissed. They had whispered the truth long before the battles were lost. Japan could not match the American arsenal. Here lies the paradox at the heart of the Pacific War. The Japanese Navy was led by officers who valued discipline, courage, and precision. They believed that superior skill might outweigh material inferiority. But across the ocean stood a nation capable of building more aircraft in a single month than Japan in an entire year. The question was never about bravery. It was about scale. And when the war ended, the very men who had commanded Japan's fleets admitted openly, they had challenged an industrial colossus. To understand how this realization took root, we must step back to the interwar years. The 1920s and 1930s were decades of ambition and anxiety for Japan. The empire had risen astonishingly fast since the late 19th century, defeating China, then Russia, and gaining colonies that promised prestige. But prestige could not feed blast furnaces or fuel carriers. Japan's home islands were poor in oil, iron ore, and bauxite. Industrial centers in Nagoya and Osaka could assemble machines, but their raw materials traveled across seas that could be easily cut off. Every admiral in Tokyo knew this. The question was, could conquest secure what the islands lacked before outside powers intervened? The United States, by contrast, appeared to live in another dimension. Vast coal reserves fueled factories in Pennsylvania. Oil gushed from Texas wells. Automobiles rolled off Detroit assembly lines in numbers that astonished foreign visitors. One Japanese attaché who toured American plants in the 1930s wrote in disbelief that a single shift at a single factory employed more men than Japan's largest aircraft plant. He sent the report home. It was read, filed, and ignored. Instead, Japanese officers clung to a different metric: spirit. They believed that devotion to duty and willingness to sacrifice would outmatch the supposed softness of American workers. A fleet imbued with Yamato soul, they argued, could overcome deficits in production. The problem with this belief was not that spirit lacked value, it inspired men to feats of endurance, but that it blinded leaders to the cold arithmetic of modern war. Picture, for a moment, a shipyard in Virginia in 1940. Dawn breaks and whistles echo over the water. Thousands of men and women pour through gates, their lunch pails clattering, boots striking pavement in unison. Sparks shower from welders working on the skeleton of a half-finished carrier. Railcars roll in with pre-cut steel plates ready to be hoisted into place. At the end of the month, another warship slides down the ways into the river. Now compare that to a Japanese yard the same year. Smaller crews, more hand tools, shortages of alloy steel, schedules slipping because a shipment of coal had been delayed by storms. The workers were skilled, devoted, and often exhausted. They produced ships of quality but never in numbers to keep pace with their enemy. Some Japanese officers knew this long before Pearl Harbor. They had studied in the United States or Europe and returned home deeply unsettled. One young officer privately remarked that America's productive power was like a mountain range stretching beyond sight. Yet in strategy meetings, such warnings were often dismissed. "Quantity is not quality," one senior official replied. "We will strike fast, win early, and they will lack the stomach for a long war." It was a gamble not only against American willpower but against the very mathematics of industry. And as events unfolded, that gamble revealed itself to be tragically misguided. By the late 1930s, Japanese leaders faced a narrowing set of choices. Sanctions from Western powers squeezed imports. Oil stockpiles dwindled. Without access to new sources, the Navy could not sustain operations for long. The solution seemed obvious: strike outward, seize territories rich in resources, and defend them fiercely until opponents sued for peace. But embedded in that strategy was an assumption that America, confronted with heavy losses early, would retreat into isolation. Few considered the possibility that those losses might only awaken a slumbering industrial behemoth. One officer later confessed, "We imagined America as a giant that did not wish to rise. We thought if we struck quickly, it would roll over and go back to sleep." Instead, the giant awoke, and once on its feet, it moved with relentless momentum. This is the stage upon which the Pacific War began. A nation rich in courage but poor in resources, daring to challenge a nation whose factories alone could decide the outcome. The early months would give Japan dazzling victories, but beneath every triumph lurked the shadow of numbers. Numbers that, once acknowledged, revealed the war's predetermined conclusion. The winter morning in Hawaii was still and calm when the Japanese strike force closed in on Pearl Harbor. The pilots who climbed into their cockpits believed they were about to deliver a blow so devastating that the Americans would be forced to accept a new balance in the Pacific. Torpedoes slung beneath wings, bombs armed, engines roaring, they descended in waves upon a harbor crowded with battleships at anchor. The attack achieved surprise. Explosions thundered across the bay. Columns of smoke twisted upward as ships listed and burned. From the air it must have looked like triumph. Yet even in that hour of apparent success, some Japanese officers sensed a darker truth. The targets they had struck were largely older battleships, relics of a previous era. The dry docks, the fuel tanks, the repair yards, those arteries that kept a navy alive, remained untouched. Carriers, the true capital ships of the new age, were not even present. One commander later reflected that what he saw disturbed him more than the fires below. Dotted around the harbor were swarms of support vessels, oilers, tenders, cargo ships, more numerous than Japan possessed in its entire navy. They were not glamorous, but they represented endurance. Without such vessels, fleets starved. With them, America could project power across oceans. Pearl Harbor was a tactical shock, but beneath it lay a strategic paradox. Japan had awakened precisely what it had hoped to avoid: an enemy willing to fight, and an enemy whose capacity to build would soon overwhelm. Within days, assembly lines across the continental United States accelerated. Workers who had once built cars now turned out tanks. Factories that once made refrigerators switched to aircraft engines. The very scale of mobilization defied comparison. Just months later, the first great naval clash of carriers unfolded in the Coral Sea. It was a battle fought not by lines of dreadnoughts but by aircraft launched from decks hundreds of miles apart. The Japanese damaged the American carrier Yorktown severely, leaving its decks buckled and compartments flooded. Japanese intelligence assumed it would take months to repair. By their own standards, such damage was crippling. Yet 3 days after limping into Pearl Harbor, Yorktown was patched, reinforced, and sailing again. Thousands of workers labored around the clock with welding torches, cranes, and prefabricated steel plates. In less than a week the ship was back at sea, ready to fight at Midway. For Japanese officers who later learned this, the realization was crushing. What they needed months to achieve, America accomplished in days. It was not just speed, it was the power of an industrial system designed for flexibility, resilience, and sheer output. At Midway the contrast became catastrophic. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, vessels painstakingly built over years, each representing irreplaceable crews and air groups. America, by contrast, had more carriers already under construction, rolling down slipways at a pace that ensured replacements would arrive before Japan could recover. Within a year, new classes of carriers, larger, more advanced, swarming with aircraft, joined the Pacific Fleet. The balance of naval power tilted irrevocably. The officers who survived Midway began to whisper doubts. One admiral scribbled in his diary that the Americans would replace their losses in months, while Japan could not in years. He was right. The tide had turned, and the logic of industry was asserting itself over the valor of men. In the following months, the grinding campaign for Guadalcanal revealed the truth in its most brutal form. Japanese destroyers raced down the slot under cover of darkness, carrying a few hundred tons of supplies at enormous risk. Many never returned. Meanwhile, American cargo ships, built in astonishing numbers, delivered thousands of tons in a single voyage. Liberty ships, welded together in shipyards by workers who had never seen the ocean, became the unsung giants of logistics. Each one could carry more than dozens of desperate Japanese runs combined. The soldiers on Guadalcanal felt the consequences in their stomachs. Japanese troops went hungry, malnourished, reduced to half-strength from disease and exhaustion. Across the lines, American troops grumbled about the monotony of canned rations while consuming thousands of calories a day. The contrast was not only in firepower but in the ability to sustain men, to feed, to clothe, to medicate. Logistics had become strategy, and in logistics Japan was fatally outmatched. Reports reached Tokyo detailing the disparity. Aircraft rolled out of American factories by the thousands each month. Engines, trucks, submarines, all produced in volumes that dwarfed Japan's capacity. The figures were so staggering that they were classified at the highest level, hidden from many officers for fear of crushing morale. Some who read them confessed privately that if even half the numbers were accurate, the war was already lost. But the war did not end. It dragged on, each campaign another demonstration of imbalance. When American carriers arrived in strength for the Battle of the Philippine Sea, they carried aircraft with more powerful engines, better armor, and well-trained crews who had logged hundreds of hours in the cockpit. Japanese pilots, rushed through training with only a fraction of that experience, faced overwhelming odds. The result was slaughter. Hundreds of Japanese planes fell from the sky, their pilots never replaced, their aircraft impossible to rebuild at comparable speed. By 1944 the skies themselves had changed. Vast bombers appeared over Japan, flying from distant islands, each aircraft a marvel of engineering with pressurized cabins and remote-controlled defenses. To build one cost more than an entire government complex in Tokyo. Yet America built them by the thousands. Each raid consumed fuel in quantities that matched Japan's monthly production. And still the bombers came night after night, fire turning cities into fields of ash. The admiral in his cell remembered all this as he wrote. Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea, each step had revealed the same truth. They had gambled on speed and spirit. Instead, they had collided with numbers that could not be fought, only endured. Factories had become the true battlefields, and in that war Japan had been defeated before it began. In the autumn of 1944, the sea near the Philippines boiled with the largest naval clash the world had ever seen. It was here, at Leyte Gulf, that Japan attempted to turn back the tide with every remaining ship that could still sail. The battle raged across multiple fronts, carriers launching strike after strike, battleships firing at ranges unthinkable a generation earlier, destroyers making desperate charges into walls of fire. But beneath the thunder of guns lay another truth. Japan had gathered its last reserves, burning precious fuel in one final gamble. America, by contrast, deployed new fleets as though drawing from a bottomless well. Dozens of fresh carriers, countless escorts, air groups fully equipped and trained. When Japanese admirals peered through binoculars at the horizon, they did not see just enemy ships. They saw production lines stretching back across an entire continent. The clash ended in catastrophe for Japan. The Imperial Navy ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Some ships limped home, many did not. More irreplaceable crews were lost, more pilots scattered into the sea. One officer who survived later recalled the silence in the wardroom afterward, broken only by the creak of the ship's hull. They had fought bravely, but the ocean itself seemed to whisper that bravery was no longer enough. As the Navy withered, the skies above the home islands filled with new machines, massive, silver-skinned bombers that dwarfed anything Japan could build. They came not in tens but in hundreds, engines droning like thunder across the night. Each aircraft carried more destructive power than entire squadrons of earlier years. They flew higher, faster, further. Intercepting them became nearly impossible. Japanese fighters, short on fuel and parts, scrambled desperately, but their guns often froze, their engines sputtered, their pilots scarcely trained. On clear nights, the people below watched as bombs fell in shimmering arcs, then turned city blocks into infernos. Wooden houses ignited instantly. Winds whipped fire into storms that devoured whole districts. Survivors stumbled through rubble, eyes stung by smoke, ears ringing with the collapse of their neighborhoods. The bombers departed, and the silence that followed was almost worse than the roar, an emptiness filled only by the crackle of smoldering ruins. The industrial imbalance was now visible not just to officers but to every citizen. They saw American planes in the sky by day, their contrails streaking white across the blue, and by night the glow of burning cities. Factories destroyed could not be rebuilt. Rail lines torn apart could not be relayed. Japan's industrial heart was not just strained, it was broken. Then came Okinawa. If Guadalcanal had revealed the strain of logistics, if Leyte had signaled naval collapse, Okinawa showed the ultimate cost of industrial disparity in human lives. The island was defended with ferocity, soldiers and civilians alike dug into caves, determined to resist until the end. Kamikaze pilots hurled themselves against American fleets, their aircraft little more than flying bombs guided by men scarcely older than boys. The strikes were terrifying. Ships were hit, decks aflame, sailors lost at sea. And yet, for every vessel struck, more arrived. Carriers rotated, repaired, returned. Destroyers were patched and sent back into action within days. American resources seemed inexhaustible. Each kamikaze attack inflicted pain, but the ocean of replacements swallowed it whole. Japanese officers watching from the shore realized that the sacrifice of their young men, however noble, could not change the outcome. The arithmetic of industry was merciless. The civilian toll on Okinawa was unbearable. Families huddled in caves as artillery thundered day and night. Food vanished, disease spread. The island became a graveyard, a grim preview of what awaited the home islands if invasion came. For American planners, the battle confirmed that further fighting would exact staggering losses on both sides. For Japanese leaders, it confirmed what some had already written in their private diaries. They were fighting not against fleets or armies, but against the machinery of an entire nation that could not be stopped. In the summer of 1945, the nightmare reached its zenith. The bombers returned not only with incendiaries but with weapons of a different nature. Explosions so vast that a single flash erased a city. The devastation was beyond comprehension. Streets vanished, rivers boiled, shadows burned into walls. The world had entered a new age of warfare. And Japan, already broken by conventional fire, now faced destruction on a scale no one had imagined. Yet even before those final blasts, the war had been decided. The factories of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Los Angeles had spoken louder than any declaration. Their voices were steel, aluminum, oil, electricity. They drowned out the drums of empire. No matter how courageous the pilots, no matter how steadfast the sailors, Japan had stood against a nation whose industrial base was 10 times larger, whose ability to replace losses was effectively infinite, and whose will to use that power proved absolute. As prisoners after the war, the surviving admirals confronted this reality in stark terms. Some admitted it openly. Others spoke only in private, their words carried in memoirs and recollections. They recognized that the war had not been lost in 1945 or even in 1944. It had been lost years earlier, when they chose to challenge a nation whose shipyards alone outproduced entire fleets, whose oil wells pumped more fuel than Japan could ever dream to secure. The battles were merely the visible unfolding of an outcome already written. One officer put it simply, "We never stood a chance." And in those words lay both tragedy and truth. The summer heat in Tokyo was suffocating when the news finally broke. The emperor's voice, faint and distant through crackling radios, announced that the war was over. Many who listened had never heard him speak before. They knelt in silence, unable to grasp the enormity of what his words meant. For soldiers who had fought on distant islands, for sailors who had survived burning decks, for civilians who had endured nights of firebombing, the unthinkable had come true. Japan had surrendered. In the military prisons, the surviving admirals sat in stunned quiet. These were men who had once commanded mighty fleets, who had plotted operations across the vast Pacific. Now they were prisoners of the very enemy they had tried to defeat. Some struggled to accept it, clinging to the notion that bravery could somehow have balanced the scales. But others, looking back with painful clarity, admitted that defeat had been written from the moment war began. They spoke of the numbers that had haunted their briefings. American shipyards launching vessels in weeks instead of months. Aircraft factories producing by the thousand, each engine rolling off assembly lines that never slept. Oil flowing in rivers, steel stacked in mountains, food supplies so abundant that soldiers could eat better in the field than Japanese citizens did at home. These were not abstractions. They were the raw facts that had crushed an empire built on hope and spirit. For the Japanese public, the surrender was more than a military defeat. It was a collapse of belief. For years they had been told that divine winds and national soul could triumph over material odds. Now, staring at smoldering cities and empty rice bowls, they understood the lie. The war had demanded sacrifice without measure, and still it was not enough. The contrast between devotion and destruction was too stark to ignore. The trials that followed revealed the extent of self-deception that had driven Japan into conflict. Documents laid bare how leaders dismissed warnings about American industry, how they underestimated the ability of a democracy to mobilize. Witness after witness admitted that they had believed a short war was possible, that early victories would force the United States to negotiate. Instead, those victories only hardened American resolve and unleashed a tidal wave of production. One admiral described his realization with bitter honesty. He had stood on the deck of a carrier during the early months of the war, convinced of triumph. Yet by 1943 he knew the truth. Every American carrier sunk would soon be replaced, every squadron shot down would reappear with newer planes and fresher pilots. His own navy, however, dwindled with each clash, the losses permanent, the replacements pitifully few. It was not a battle of courage versus cowardice. It was a battle of endurance, and in that contest Japan had no chance. The collapse carried a psychological weight that went beyond strategy. Generations raised to believe in invincibility now faced humiliation. Children walked through ruins where schools once stood. Farmers plowed fields under skies patrolled by foreign aircraft. Soldiers returned home, gaunt and hollow-eyed, their uniforms threadbare, their medals meaningless. The sense of having been betrayed by their own leaders gnawed at the nation's spirit. Yet within that despair flickered something unexpected. For some officers, the defeat became a grim form of liberation. They no longer had to pretend. The illusions of spirit conquering steel were shattered. What remained was a sober acknowledgement of reality. They could finally admit what they had known all along, that courage without resources is tragedy, that sacrifice without supply is waste, and that modern war is decided not only on battlefields but in the furnaces of factories. This recognition, painful as it was, planted seeds of change. The very men who had once led fleets began to speak of industry not as an enemy to be challenged but as a foundation to be studied. They spoke of how America had marshaled science, labor, and resources into a seamless whole. They urged their countrymen not to despair at defeat but to learn from it. For if America's factories had destroyed Japan, perhaps factories built with similar vision could one day rebuild it. Still, in the weeks immediately following surrender, the mood was one of profound emptiness. The empire that had promised destiny now lay in ashes. Cities were flattened, industries crippled, millions displaced. The once proud navy had been scuttled or surrendered, its flags lowered forever. The once feared Air Force had vanished, its pilots dead, its planes wrecked on airstrips. The very idea of national strength seemed to have dissolved. In interviews conducted by occupation forces, officers spoke with surprising candor. Some admitted shame for having led men into hopeless battles. Others confessed relief that the suffering had finally ended. One remarked that the war had been less a contest of fleets and more a contest of factories, and that in such a contest Japan never had a chance. His words echoed those of others who had come to the same conclusion independently. The refrain was consistent. The war was lost not at Okinawa, not at Hiroshima, but in the very decision to challenge an opponent whose industrial power dwarfed their own. For the Allied victors, the scale of American industry seemed almost unreal even to themselves. Shipyards stood littered with vessels still under construction, some destined never to see combat because the war had ended before they were needed. Aircraft sat in rows stretching to the horizon, more than enough to replace any conceivable loss. Warehouses bulged with supplies, ammunition, and food that would never be shipped overseas. The war machine had not only sustained the fight, it had outproduced the demands of battle. It was proof that industrial might, once unleashed, could overwhelm even the fiercest opponent. For Japan, this realization was both devastating and clarifying. The dream of empire had ended in ruin, but the lesson was unmistakable. No nation can hope to prevail in modern war without the means to sustain it. Courage and sacrifice may inspire, but without the steel, oil, and machines to back them, they lead only to loss. The first months of occupation brought daily reminders of defeat, yet also glimpses of something remarkable. American trucks rolled through shattered streets, their engines humming steadily, carrying food, medicine, and materials. To citizens who had grown accustomed to scarcity, these convoys seemed almost unreal. How could a nation that had waged war across oceans still possess so much to give away? Every crate unloaded, every sack of grain distributed, told the same story. The victors had fought with abundance, while Japan had fought with desperation. Factories that had once churned out aircraft parts and munitions now stood silent. Windows shattered, roofs collapsed, machines coated in dust. Yet American engineers and Japanese workers soon walked through those same halls together, cataloging equipment, repairing what could be salvaged, dismantling what was too damaged. For many Japanese technicians, the experience was a revelation. They saw up close the tools, techniques, and systems that had enabled mass production on a scale they had never imagined. Conveyor belts, standardized gauges, interchangeable parts. These were not abstract concepts but physical realities standing before them. What struck them most was not just the machinery but the organization. Workforces coordinated in shifts, management structured with clear accountability, quality control applied at every stage. Where Japan had relied on craftsmanship and improvisation, America had built systems designed to repeat excellence thousands of times. It was not a matter of talent but of process, not genius but structure. And that difference had proven decisive. Among the officers who gave testimony, some began to speak not only of defeat but of potential. If such methods could be studied, perhaps Japan could rise again, not through conquest but through industry. They urged policymakers to absorb these lessons, to move beyond the romantic illusions of spirit alone, and to embrace the practical power of science, technology, and organization. Their words carried weight because they had seen both sides. The bravery of their own soldiers and the industrial tidal wave that bravery could not withstand. The occupation authorities, too, understood the importance of transformation. Rather than dismantle Japan completely, they sought to rebuild it as a partner. Agricultural reform increased yields. New labor policies encouraged efficiency. Education emphasized science and mathematics. Foreign experts introduced modern methods of production and quality control. One American statistician, teaching seminars in Tokyo in the early 1950s, showed factory managers how to measure errors and prevent them before they multiplied. His lessons seemed simple, even obvious, but they sparked a quiet revolution. For the first time, Japanese industry began to see consistency as a strength equal to creativity. Workers who had once riveted ships for war now assembled sewing machines, cameras, and radios. Plants that had once forged armor plates now rolled out kitchenware and bicycles. At first, these products were crude, cheap, and derided abroad. But each year they improved. Managers obsessed over reducing defects. Engineers tinkered endlessly with designs. Workers took pride in small refinements. Slowly, imperceptibly, the reputation shifted. By the late 1950s, Japan was no longer known only for defeat and ruin but for goods that were reliable, affordable, and increasingly competitive. The transformation was not without pain. Unemployment, poverty, and the scars of bombing remained visible. Many veterans struggled to find their place in a society turning away from militarism. Yet the momentum of reconstruction was undeniable. The same discipline that had once driven soldiers to endure hunger and hardship now drove factory crews to meet quotas and improve quality. National pride, once invested in battleships and aircraft, began to attach itself to consumer goods that reached foreign markets. The world took notice. By the 1960s, Japanese cameras rivaled German models, Japanese motorcycles found eager buyers abroad, and Japanese cars began to appear on American roads. Each success carried echoes of the lessons learned in defeat. Standardization, efficiency, mass production. The very weapons that had crushed Japan in war now became the tools of its resurgence in peace. The irony was not lost on those who remembered the occupation's early days. The factories that had been humbled now hummed with new life, their purpose transformed but their energy undiminished. For the generation that had fought, this economic rise offered a bittersweet vindication. They could tell themselves that the sacrifices had not been entirely wasted, that out of destruction had come renewal. For the younger generation, born amid ruins but raised amid recovery, the war was less a personal wound than a historical backdrop. They inherited both the scars and the determination, channeling them into building a society that valued stability and prosperity over conquest. In retrospect, the testimony of defeated admirals and generals took on a different meaning. What at first seemed like confessions of weakness became, over time, guideposts for national rebirth. Their recognition that modern strength lies not in spirit alone but in productive capacity laid the intellectual foundation for the economic miracle to come. They had been wrong in war but right in wisdom. By admitting that courage without resources cannot prevail, they opened the door for courage with resources to flourish in peace. As the 1960s turned into the 1970s, the scale of change astonished the world. Japan, once synonymous with devastation, now stood among the world's leading economies. Its cities buzzed with neon lights and bullet trains, its exports filled store shelves across continents, its companies became household names. The story of industrial disparity that had doomed Japan in war now became the story of industrial mastery that defined it in peace. It was a transformation few could have predicted amid the ashes of 1945, yet it was rooted in the hard truths revealed in those early interrogations. By the time 2 decades had passed, the scars of war were still visible in Japan, but so too was a new confidence. Cities once reduced to ashes were now alive with electricity and commerce. Factories that had once rattled with the clamor of weapons now echoed with the rhythm of assembly lines producing goods for a global market. To walk through Tokyo in the early 1960s was to witness a nation that had redefined itself, not by battles fought, but by products made. The irony lingered. The very forces that had guaranteed defeat in the 1940s, the industrial disparity, the lack of resources, the inability to match a continental power's production, now guided Japan's rebirth. Engineers studied methods once dismissed, managers implemented systems once ignored, workers practiced routines once thought beneath the dignity of artisanship. What had been seen as weakness in wartime became the cornerstone of strength in peace. It was as though defeat had stripped away illusions, leaving behind the clarity to rebuild on firmer ground. Yet the memory of those earlier years never fully faded. For the officers who had testified in prison, their words remained etched in history. They had admitted, sometimes through gritted teeth, that the war had been unwinnable from the start. They had confessed that spirit alone could not withstand factories that never slept, that courage could not refill empty oil tanks, that sacrifice could not replace steel that did not exist. Their honesty was painful, but it was also prophetic. It foreshadowed the path Japan would take, away from swords and ships toward science and steel, toward prosperity built not on conquest but on cooperation. This shift carried profound meaning not just for Japan but for the world. The Pacific War had demonstrated, with brutal clarity, that modern conflict is shaped less by battlefield maneuvers than by industrial capacity. The numbers that once appeared in intelligence reports, tons of steel, barrels of oil, ships launched, planes assembled, were not dry statistics. They were the true weapons of war. And they determined, more than any general's plan or admiral's daring, the outcome of the struggle. For the United States, the victory affirmed a national faith in democracy's ability to mobilize. Factories that once built cars built bombers. Workers who once assembled refrigerators welded steel plates for ships. Farmers who once supplied towns fed armies across oceans. The scale was astonishing, but it was also a testament to organization and unity. The war proved that a society that could harness its resources efficiently could project power beyond imagination. For Japan, the lesson was harsher but ultimately transformative. The nation learned that no amount of willpower could substitute for infrastructure, that no level of devotion could overcome empty warehouses. It was a realization born in ruin, but one that became the foundation for peace. By embracing those lessons, Japan did not merely recover. It thrived, eventually standing shoulder to shoulder with the very nation that had once overwhelmed it. There is a haunting quality to the testimonies preserved from those years. Some of the men spoke in bitterness, others in sorrow, and a few in something like relief. They had carried the burden of impossible expectations, and in defeat they could finally tell the truth. One recalled watching American supply ships unload endless cargo, each vessel carrying more material than his entire fleet could transport in weeks. Another remembered the speed of American repairs, ships returning to battle in days that would have taken his navy months. Each story was a fragment of a larger picture, the realization that Japan had been fighting not an equal but a colossus. But from those fragments emerged a greater truth. War had revealed the power of industry, but peace would reveal its greater purpose. The machines that once produced bombers could produce passenger planes, the factories that once forged cannons could make cars, the research that once guided weapons could pioneer electronics. The same logic applied to both war and peace: scale, efficiency, organization. The difference lay in how that power was directed. America had shown what industry could achieve in war. Japan in time would show what it could achieve in peace. And so, when we look back at those prison testimonies, we see more than confessions. We see the beginnings of transformation. We see men acknowledging not only their defeat, but the pathway to renewal. Their recognition of disparity became the blueprint for growth. Their acknowledgement of weakness became the foundation of strength. It is a reminder that history's harshest lessons often hold the seeds of future triumphs. The story of Japan's war and its aftermath is not simply one of tragedy or defeat. It is a story of awakening, to the realities of modern power, to the necessity of industry, to the potential of peace. It is a story that shows how a nation can stumble into disaster, confront its mistakes with honesty, and emerge with a new vision. And it is a story that continues to resonate today, reminding us that in the great struggles of history, numbers matter, resources matter, but above all, the willingness to learn from failure matters most. So when we hear the phrase, "We never stood a chance," we might hear despair. But we might also hear clarity. For Japan, those words became both an epitaph for war and a prologue for peace. They marked the end of illusions and the beginning of understanding. And from that understanding grew a nation that, within a single generation, transformed ashes into innovation, and defeat into dignity. That is the enduring legacy of those testimonies. Not the admission of hopelessness, but the proof that even in defeat, truth can guide renewal. The war was lost in factories, but the peace was won in them as well. And in that paradox lies one of history's most remarkable transformations. A nation that once fell to overwhelming production power, rising again by mastering that very force, and proving that industry at its best can serve not destruction but humanity.